This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at the Jinn creature type. Jinn is one of Magic's oldest creature types, with Alpha's Hotti Jin, the first one ever printed. In fact, the early years of Magic featured a whole lot of Djinns, and for a long time it was effectively the iconic creature type for blue. While they didn't yet have that designation back in the 1990s, most Djinns did have the characteristics you'd expect of an iconic type today. They were powerful, showed up in every set, largely appeared at higher rarities, and were largely associated with one color. However, they were eventually supplanted by Sphinxes, who are the iconic type for blue today. That's not to say we don't still see Djinns, but they tend to only show up every now and then, as opposed to in every single set. Some planes like Tarkir and Arcavios actually have a whole lot of Djinns. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the Jinn creature type or be able to make a Jinn creature token. In all, there were 60 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 Djinns in Magic. At number 10, it's Ember Wild Captain. For 3 generic and a red, it's a 4/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Whenever an opponent attacks you while you're the Monarch, the Captain deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand. If you're the Monarch, it means you get to draw a card at the beginning of your end step, so the Captain is often going to give you at least a 2-for-1. The downside is your opponent can become the Monarch if one of their creatures deals combat damage to you. So the Captain's design is a pretty nice way of punishing your opponent for trying to take your crown away. It can be especially punishing if you're the beatdown and your opponent has a fistful of cards. The Captain is from Commander Legends, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage. It's gained a couple of points in blue-red tempo decks and Legacy, but those points both came in 2021, so future Djinns are likely to bump this off the list. At number 9, it's Old Man of the Sea. While it doesn't have the Jinn creature type in its original Arabian Nights printing, which also happens to be its only printing since it's on the reserved list, it does have the Jinn type in the Oracle text. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's a 2/3, and you can choose not to untap it during your untap step. You can tap it and gain control of a creature with power less than or equal to Old Man of the Seas for as long as it remains tapped, and that creature's power remains less than or equal to Old Man of the Seas. In other words, it's a really specific mind control effect attached to a creature. That type of effect is always great, since you simultaneously subtract from your opponent's board while adding to your own. But you can even do this one at instant speed, which isn't the case for most versions of this effect, and that can really wreak havoc on your opponent. It was played in a control deck that top-8'd the very first sanctioned competitive Magic event ever, the 1994 World Championships, and in 2005 it also picked up a top 8 in a Vintage Stacks deck. It's been almost 20 years since it last gained a point though, so it's another Djinn that might not be here very much longer. At number 8, it's Juzam Jin. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 5/5, and during your upkeep it does 1 damage to you. This Djinn is probably the most iconic Djinn of all time, even more so than Hotti Jin, and just one of the most iconic creatures in Magic history. This is partly a result of its amazing art, but it was also thought of as one of the strongest creatures in the game during Magic's early days. Some even thought it was usurping that title from Serra Angel. While he didn't have flying or vigilance, Juzam Jin did cost 1 less mana and it had better stats than the Angel did. Of course, the downside here is that the Djinn will damage you every turn, but if you're swinging for 5 at a time, that's obviously not going to matter too much. A creature with this stat line was just unheard of at the time. Juzam Jin was played in black decks during Magic's early competitive days, most of which we would classify as mid-range, but it hasn't gained any points since 1995. At number 7, it's Spout Jin. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 4/4 flyer. As with Juzam Jin, this was a crazy good stat line in the 1990s, so it had to come with a downside. You have to return an untapped island to your hand every upkeep, otherwise you have to sacrifice it. That's not the biggest downside ever for an efficient evasive creature though. As a result, the Djinn was played in mono blue aggro decks in both block and extended between 1997 and 1998. At number 6, it's Jinn Emperor. This one's going to make some people mad, since it's a digital-only card on Magic Arena. While I've been rewarding cards for top 8s in Historic and Alchemy all along, this is the first time a digital-only card has ever made a top 10, because typically there aren't enough events in those formats for a card that is only legal in them to make a top 10. While some people say these cards aren't really Magic cards, and you are entitled to that opinion, the fact of the matter is that Jinn Emperor is legal at official Premier level events in the Historic and Alchemy formats. It doesn't really matter whether or not I like or dislike digital-only cards. For these lists, all that matters is the data, and all I'm doing is reporting these results to you. Anyhow, is 3 generic and 3 blue for a 5/6 flyer with Ward 2. You can also pay 1 generic and a blue and discard it to tap a non-land permanent and draw a card. Then, you can exile 2 other Kalims from your graveyard, and when you do, you return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. When you discard Kalim, you also conjure a card named Kalim into your library 7th from the top. In other words, Kalim cycles and gives you a minor effect at the same time, and if you've cycled enough of them into your graveyard, you end up basically getting a 2-mana 5/6 flyer with Ward 2, and you're likely to end up with enough Kalim since he sticks copies of himself into your library. That's pretty powerful, so powerful that 5 of the top 8 decks at the 2022 Arena Championship ran Kalim. And that's how he managed to make this list despite being a digital-only card, because he really dominated that one event. If you're someone who hates digital-only cards, the good news is that there aren't really alchemy events these days, and in the long run Kalim is likely to fall off of the list. It'll probably stick around for a while though. At number 5, it's Tempest Gin. For 3 blue mana, it's a 0/4 flyer, and it gets +1/+0 for each island you control. This Jinn is hard to cast if you're not mono blue, but he also pays you off for going in that direction by being a really efficient evasive threat, one with high enough toughness that it can't be dealt with super easily in most cases. Unsurprisingly, it gained all of its points in standard mono blue aggro decks. These decks look to get the Jinn or another powerful flyer in play and then protect it with cheap counter magic. At number 4, it's Spout Tyrant. For 5 generic and 3 blue, it's a 5/5 flyer, and whenever you cast a spell, you return target permanent to its owner's hand. 8 mana is a lot, but you get quite an impressive creature out of the deal, as it can not only hit hard in the air, but you'll also be bouncing a whole lot of permanents, making it even harder for your opponent to survive. Of course, as is usually the case for creatures that cost this much mana, people don't usually actually pay to cast this. All of its points have come in Legacy Reanimator decks. If you're bringing back the Tyrant on turn 1 or 2 with Reanimator or Exhume, your opponent is pretty much done, especially because Legacy decks run a ton of free spells, so it isn't impossible that you just bounce your opponent's whole board when you put this into play early. That said, these days it isn't one of the premier reanimation targets in the format, as we've gotten some more impressive options in recent years, like Archon of Cruelty and Atraxa Grand Unifier. At number 3, it's Stratus Dancer. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 2/1 flyer, which is a pretty nice rate. It also has Megamorph, which means you can play it face down for 3 generic mana as a 2/2. You can pay 1 generic and a blue and turn it face up, and because this is Megamorph instead of regular morph, not only does it turn face up, it also gets a +1/+1 counter. Yeah, that's a really lazily designed mechanic, but this is a good card. When the Dancer is turned face up, it counters target instant or sorcery. Either way you play this, you end up with a fairly reasonable flyer, and the counter upside can be really punishing. The Dancer was mostly played in aggressive decks while it was in Standard, including Bant Aggro, Devotion to Blue, Collected Company, and even Morph decks. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, and it doesn't look super well positioned to do so. At number 2, it's Aram Jin. Like Mahamoti and Juzam Jin, this is an iconic Jin from Magic's early days, and when it comes to tournament performance, it's been the most impressive of the 3. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 4/5, and at the beginning of your upkeep, target non-wall creature an opponent controls gains Forest Walk until your next upkeep. Obviously, that's a pretty big downside, as you're going to be making an opposing creature unblockable every turn, but the Jinn was super efficient for the time, so the downside was often worth it, especially because decks were built around finding ways to minimize the downside as much as possible. The most successful decks featuring the Jinn combined it with Armageddon. The two went together so well that there was a deck called Armageddon, which was an aggro deck that sought to stick a few creatures and then cast Armageddon while you're ahead on board, at which point you would take over the game. You could also simply not play any forests or sacrifice them to your Zuran Orb, so your opponent's creatures wouldn't be unblockable. So, Yeah, it was a 4 mana 4/5 with little or no downside in the decks that played it, and in the early days of competitive Magic, it was simply one of the best creatures around, especially because it was capable of even attacking through the feared Serra Angel. Aram Jin was a fixture at standard and extended competitive Magic events between 1994 and 1998, but it has since become really outclassed by more powerful creatures, and it doesn't have a single point since 1998. Still, all that performance in the 1990s is enough for it to hold a fairly prominent spot on this list. And at number 1, it's Hotti Jin. For 1 generic and 2 blue, it's a star 4 with flying, and its power is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. It also decreases the cost of your instants and sorceries by 1 generic mana, making it even easier for you to cast those type of spells, which in turn also makes it easier for you to make Hotti Jin's power really high. Since being printed in 2022, this Jinn has been an important card in Standard, where it's been powering mono-blue tempo decks. These decks have a fairly prominent spell sub-theme and run lots of cheap spells. As with the decks that use Tempest Gin in Standard, these mono-blue aggro decks look to resolve something like the Jinn, and then protect it with a lot of cheap spells. The deck has so many of those cheap spells that the Jinn often has 10 or more power in the deck, which is obviously a big problem for your opponent. While it hasn't gained any points outside of Standard so far, it is seeing play in Pioneer, and it may just be a matter of time before it gains points there too. Still, once it rotates out of Standard, it doesn't look like it's going to continue to gain points at such an impressive rate. However, Djinns are printed infrequently enough that this still may be the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 Djinns in Magic. If you want to own any of these creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific creature types, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.